Welcome to the Thinking Stack.
Great to be here.
Today we're wrestling with a question that I think resonates with quite a few people, especially those who maybe prefer a quiet night in.
Ah, yes. The big one. Am I just introverted? Or is there something else going on?
Exactly. Something maybe deeper, potentially linked to past experiences, driving that need for solitude.
It sounds so simple, doesn't it? Like a neat little box.
But it's deceptive. Those easy labels, well, they often fall apart when you look closer.
They really do. So yeah, prepare yourselves. We're going to unstack this piece by piece using the ITS framework.
Right. Because we see this pattern, don't we? Society often reaches for personality traits, introversion to explain things like withdrawal or discomfort.
It's like calling someone who flinches out loud sounds just sensitive.
Yeah, without asking why they might flinch. Maybe something happened that wired their nervous system that way.
Precisely. And that label, introvert, while maybe offering some temporary understanding,
It can actually stop us from getting real insight, can it? And crucially, stop healing.
absolutely. If we just settle for introvert, we might completely miss what's really driving someone's experience.
So just to be clear, our aim isn't to knock enjoying your own company. That's perfectly fine.
Oh, definitely not. It's about looking much, much closer at the why. Why the preference for solitude? Is it genuinely about recharging?
Or is it something else entirely? That's what we're digging into today.
And that leads us straight into our first layer, cognitive cleanse.
Okay?
Time to scrub away the fuzzy thinking, the assumptions, and really ask, what's actually true about introversion and, well, its potential shadow trauma?
Right. Let's tackle that core statement. I'm just an introvert. It sounds so certain.
Almost final, yeah. But how much solid ground does it actually stand on?
Well, for some people, it might be perfectly accurate, right?
Absolutely. It might hold a lot of truth. But for others, it could be a convenient story, maybe even an unconscious one.
A way to explain things without having to look deeper.
Exactly. You might genuinely recharge in solitude, fitting the definition from solid psychological models, or you might be mistaking the echoes of trauma for a personality trait.
The key is telling the difference.
It is. It's, like you said, two people sitting quietly, one's reading happily, the other's weathering an internal storm but looks calm.
Same behavior, totally different internal reality.
Precisely. And this is where we need a clear, evidence-based definition of introversion, not just feelings or, those online quizzes.
Definitely not those quizzes.
Yeah.
So the Big Five personality model comes up here.
Yes, it offers a much more rigorous framework.
And it doesn't just mean shy, does it? It's quite specific.
Not at all. It's not about social anxiety or hating people. In the Big Five, introversion is basically the low end of the extroversion scale.
Extroversion being seeking stimulation from the outside world, social interaction.
Right. So introversion means less need for that external buzz, finding lots of social interaction draining rather than energizing. It's fundamentally about energy management.
Energy in, energy out. Makes sense. What else characterizes real trait-based introversion according to this model?
Well, there's often a higher sensitivity to stimuli, noise, chaos, novelty.
Okay.
A preference for smaller groups or one-on-one deeper conversations rather than big superficial gatherings. A tendency to think things through internally before speaking, processing first, talking second.
Right.
And this one might seem counterintuitive, often a higher baseline level of cortical arousal.
Higher baseline cortical arousal. Okay, let's unpack that. What does that actually mean?
Think of it like your brain's idle speed is naturally set a bit higher.
Okay.
Even when resting, there's more internal activity. So external stimulation, loud music, lots of people talking can feel overwhelming more quickly because your system is already quite busy internally.
Like a microphone that's already turned up high? Even quiet sounds seem loud.
That's a great analogy, yes. And crucially, this isn't rooted in fear or shame or avoiding threats.
It's a preference based on managing that internal energy and sensitivity.
Exactly. It's, I choose this because it feels better, more sustainable for me, not I have to do this because I'm scared of the alternative, a totally different motivation.
Okay, crucial distinction. Now, the elephant in the room, Myers-Briggs, the MBTI.
Ah, yes. Still very much kicking around.
It has its own introvert category. What does our cognitive cleanse say about its validity?
Well, if the Big Five is like a proper geological survey map,
Yeah.
the MBTI is more like a colorful, appealing tourist map that, well, gets some key landmarks wrong.
Okay.
Our sources are pretty blunt. It's pseudoscience. One even called it a feel-good horoscope with a corporate logo.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Harsh. But why? So many people swear by it, find it useful. What's the actual problem?
The core problem is the lack of scientific backbone. For one, it has almost zero predictive validity.
Meaning?
Meaning, knowing your MBTI type tells you basically nothing reliable about your job performance or relationship success or anything concrete. And the reliability. It's shockingly bad. Studies show up to 75% of people get a different result if they retake it just weeks later.
75%? That's not measuring anything stable, is it?
Not really. It's more like a mood ring sometimes, and it forces people into these rigid boxes, right? Introvert or extrovert.
Yeah, no spectrum.
Exactly.
Yeah.
False dichotomies. Real people are usually somewhere in between. Plus, it's a magnet for confirmation bias.
How so?
You read the description, you find bits that resonate, you think, oh, that's me, and you remember all the times you acted that way, conveniently forgetting the times you didn't.
So it feels good to be categorized, but it's not actually measuring personality accurately.
Pretty much. It's more about that feeling of understanding than actual solid measurement.
Okay. So if MBTI isn't the guide, how do we start to tell when that introvert label might actually be hiding something else, like the impact of trauma?
This is where the cognitive cleanse gets really critical, because some behaviors do look similar on the surface.
Like withdrawal, preferring solitude, seeming uncomfortable socially.
Exactly. Those things can be introversion, but they can also be major signs of underlying trauma, especially complex trauma or CPTSD.
And CPTSD, just to remind ourselves, often comes from prolonged, repeated, difficult experiences, right? Especially early in life, not just one single event.
That's right. And the way that shows up in behavior, even physically, can be quite different from trait introversion.
Okay, how so?
We might see things like chronic shutdown. That's the nervous system defaulting to a low-energy, disconnected state, often called the dorsal vagal state.
Numbness, detachment.
Yes. Or dissociation, feeling detached from the present, from your body as a coping mechanism. Not just daydreaming, something more profound.
Right.
Avoidance patterns that go beyond just skipping a party, like actively escaping situations or relationships that trigger a sense of threat, even if it's not obvious why.
Okay.
And often a really negative self-view, feeling flawed, like you don't belong. That's very different from an introvert just accepting their need for quiet.
Yeah, that sounds much more painful.
And the nerve system can be cycling, too. Between hyperarousal, feeling wired, on edge, scanning for danger, and hypoarousal, that numb, shut-down state.
That paints a really different picture from someone just enjoying peace and quiet with a book. It sounds like a constant struggle with feeling safe.
It absolutely is. And these aren't just more extreme versions of introversion. They're often qualitatively different experiences, rooted in the body, trying to manage the ongoing fallout from trauma.
So the behavior might look similar, avoiding the party, but the reason is totally different. Where does the confusion most often happen? What are the key overlaps?
The overlap is definitely where the confusion lies, but we can break it down. Think about the motivation for being alone.
Yeah.
An introvert usually seeks solitude to recharge, right? To find peace, reflect.
Yeah.
Someone with trauma might seek solitude to escape feeling overwhelmed or threatened, to shut down difficult emotions. It's a refuge, not just a preference.
One is choice. The other feels like a necessity for survival. What about social avoidance itself?
For an introvert, skipping a big party is usually preference. Nah, too draining, I'll read instead.
Right.
For someone with trauma history, it might be driven by deep fear of vulnerability, mistrust from past hurts, or terror of getting emotionally dysregulated around others. Less about energy, more about perceived danger.
And their self-perception, how they feel about themselves.
Generally, an introvert has a stable sense of self. Liking alone time doesn't usually come with shame.
Okay.
But trauma often brings heavy burdens of shame, feeling worthless. That feeling can fuel the withdrawal. It's less, I like being alone, and more, I feel I should be alone. I'm not good enough for others.
Wow, yeah, that's a huge difference. And their actual nervous system state, even when alone.
Very different, likely. An introvert alone is usually calm, grounded, systems not on high alert.
Okay.
Someone with trauma, even alone, might still be hypervigilant inside, scanning for threats, or maybe dissociated, numb, disconnected.
So the quiet outside doesn't match the quiet inside.
Exactly. And one source made a great point. How do you feel after time alone? The introvert feels restored, recharged. The person with trauma might still feel unsafe, on edge, like the all-clear signal never fully arrives.
That's a powerful differentiator. So the takeaway is, if the behavior is consistently driven by fear, by managing intense emotions from past wounds, it's probably protection, not personality.
Precisely. And this isn't just subjective stuff. Neuroscience shows different things happening biologically.
Okay, let's get into that. What do brain studies show? Introverts versus trauma survivors.
With introverts, we often see that higher baseline cortical arousal we talked about.
Right.
Also, evidence for increased dopamine sensitivity, meaning big rewards or lots of excitement, can feel like too much.
Which explains preferring calmer activities.
Exactly. And maybe more activity in the default mode network, the part involved in internal thought, self-reflection.
So a brain wired for more internal activity, easily overstimulated, maybe more reflective. How does that compare to the impact of trauma?
The picture often looks quite different. We might see a hyperactive amygdala the threat detector is stuck on.
Always scanning for danger.
Yes. And conversely, maybe less activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part that helps regulate emotions, make calm decisions.
Making it harder to manage fear or anxiety.
Right. The hippocampus, important for memory and context, can be affected too, making it hard to feel like the past is truly past. And often, disruption to the vagal nerve system, the system that helps us calm down, feel safe, connect socially, it loses flexibility.
So really fundamental differences in how the brain is processing threat, safety, social cues.
Absolutely. As one source put it, these aren't just different circuits, they're different biological realities. You can't just think your way out of a trauma response like you might adjust a preference.
There were some powerful quotes contrasting these experiences too.
Yeah, really stark, like the idea that introverts naturally seek calmer, acetylcholine-driven activities because dopamine is too much.
Versus Bessel van der Kolk's point about traumatized people feeling fundamentally unsafe inside their own bodies.
Right. The past living in their physical sensations. And Peter Levine saying trauma shutdown isn't a choice, it's a physiological collapse.
Not a peaceful retreat at all, which leads to debunking that common myth.
Quiet people are just introverts.
Yeah. The sources really challenge that, saying silence can mean many things.
It can be introversion, or it can be hiding, being frozen in fear, silent suffering.
And if we don't ask why someone is quiet,
we risk being complicit, right? We miss seeing the potential pain.
So the big takeaway from this cognitive cleanse, introversion is real, but we have to be super careful not to assume all quiet withdrawal comes from the same place.
Exactly. And our culture doesn't always help. We sometimes pathologize sensitivity, but also romanticize being stoic.
And all those personality tests making money.
Right. They muddy the waters, often ignoring the reality of trauma. So introvert becomes this convenient, safe label.
Safe, but potentially destructive if it hides unaddressed wounds and stops someone getting help.
Precisely. It conceals, prevents healing, and feels safe while locking the problem in place. Which brings us neatly to layer 2. Moral intelligence.
Okay, moral intelligence. What's the right thing here?
And the core issue we're looking at is what we might call the diagnostic lie. It's just personality.
How is it a lie, morally speaking?
Well, think about moral outsourcing. It's when we slap that introverted label on someone, perhaps unconsciously, to avoid actually engaging with their potential pain or complexity.
It's easier than really listening. Or sitting with someone's distress.
Much easier. It's easier than holding space for human suffering. So mislabeling trauma as just personality. It's not just a clinical error. It can be a kind of systemic betrayal.
A betrayal. Strong word. Who benefits when this happens, when trauma gets called introversion?
Good question. Several players, often unintentionally. The individual might benefit temporarily. It feels safer, right? It gives them a non-pathological identity. I'm just built this way. It helps avoid the shame often linked with trauma. It can feel like acceptance, even if it's actually a form of resignation.
Okay, so temporary shield. Who else benefits? Clinicians.
Potentially. It can be a shortcut. Dealing with deep trauma is complex, emotionally taxing work. A simpler personality explanation avoids that. There might even be countertransference, the therapist's own discomfort, leading them to prefer a less charged label.
And institutions. Schools, workplaces, healthcare.
Oh, definitely. If someone is just introverted, the institution might feel less responsible for providing support or accommodations. It deflects responsibility. It saves resources. Think about schools, HR departments, even the military labeling can be cheaper than addressing underlying issues.
So the system saves money or effort by calling it personality.
And ultimately, society benefits in a way, too. It allows us to avoid confronting just how pervasive trauma actually is. It upholds the extrovert ideal, the idea that outgoing is normal and quiet needs explaining away.
Okay, so lots of people and systems benefit, even if unconsciously, from this mislabeling. But someone must pay the price.
Absolutely. And the price is paid almost entirely by the trauma survivors themselves.
Oh, what's the cost to them?
They get missed. Their real struggles are overlooked. They might internalize the mask, start believing, I am just quiet shock word, rather than, I am reacting this way because of what happened.
So the numbness or withdrawal becomes their identity.
Exactly. And we also see diagnostic double standards playing out here based on things like gender and race.
How does that work?
Well, think about gender. A woman showing distress or withdrawal might be labeled overreacting, too emotional, maybe even borderline.
Right.
But a man showing similar quietness or withdrawal, he might be seen as stoic, reserved, a typical quiet guy, or introverted, less pathologized perhaps, but still fundamentally misunderstood. His pain is dismissed as personality.
So resilience in men, pathology in women for similar outward signs.
Often, yes. And for racial minorities, it gets even more complex. Cultural norms around communication or showing emotion might be misinterpreted as introversion. Somatic symptoms, physical signs of distress, might be dismissed more readily. Shutdown behavior might be seen as non-compliance or resistance rather than a trauma response. There can be an overdiagnosis of things like disruptive behavior disorders in kids while the underlying trauma is missed.
This sounds like structural neglect. The system itself is set up to miss certain people's pain based on who they are.
That's a powerful way to put it. It is structural neglect. And it highlights that diagnosis isn't neutral. It's an act of power.
How so?
Telling someone you're just introverted isn't just a description. It can function as a moral verdict. It implies this is just who you are. It's not a problem we need to address. It becomes a systemic permission slip to do nothing.
Wow. So the label helps the system maintain itself, potentially harms the individual, and keeps the trauma locked away through a kind of moral bypassing.
Exactly. That's the core insight of Layer 2. It's a convenient truth for the system, but a damaging one for the person caught in it.
Which leads us to Layer 3, systemic foresight. What happens next if we keep getting this wrong?
If we keep confusing trauma with introversion, we're essentially setting up a systemic time bomb. The consequences ripple outwards.
Okay, let's trace those ripples. What are the individual consequences down the line?
For the person mislabeled, chronic isolation, but not the restorative kind introverts choose. This is painful, unwanted disconnection, getting the wrong treatment. If you think someone's just introverted, you might encourage self-acceptance of their solitude. But if it's trauma, they need trauma-informed care. Maybe therapy focused on nervous system regulation or processing past events. Wrong treatment can actually make things worse.
That's iatrogenic harm caused by the treatment itself.
Precisely. Then there's the physical health impact. Untreated chronic trauma, being stuck in those stress states. It takes a huge toll on the body. Chronic inflammation, autoimmune issues, digestive problems, cardiovascular disease. The list is long.
The body keeps the score, as they say.
It really does, and maladaptive coping mechanisms. If the real issue isn't addressed, people find other ways to cope: substance use, disordered eating, self-harm, unhealthy relationship patterns.
And the most severe consequence?
Increased risk of suicide. When pain is consistently misunderstood, invalidated, and untreated, hopelessness can set in. The link between CPTSD and suicidal ideation is tragically strong.
So the individual cost is potentially devastating? What about institutions, schools, workplaces, therapy itself?
They suffer too, or rather, they perpetuate harm. In schools, the quiet child, assumed to be introverted, might actually be struggling significantly, maybe dissociating or dealing with chaos at home. They get ignored, overlooked, their needs aren't met. Some research even links this kind of invisibility to pathways like the school-to-prison pipeline later on.
Ignored suffering leading to negative outcomes. What about workplaces, HR departments?
Labels can be weaponized. Someone's trauma-driven need for predictability or quiet might be framed as not being a team player or resistant to change. Their coping mechanisms might be exploited if they overwork to feel safe or valuable. Performance reviews focus on the personality flaw instead of the underlying need for safety or support.
And therapy. If the therapist misreads trauma as introversion.
Huge risk of misattunement. The therapy won't resonate, won't address the core wounds. The client feels unseen, misunderstood. And what happens then?
They drop out.
Exactly. Therapy dropout rates are significant when there's a poor fit or lack of attunement, especially with complex trauma. The very place they sought help can end up feeling invalidating.
This paints a picture of cascading failures. How did these things create feedback loops,
Yeah.
making the problem worse systemically?
Well, think about research. If diagnostic practices consistently mislabel trauma as introversion, the data we collect is skewed.
Oh, right.
Research based on that flawed data will draw inaccurate conclusions about both introversion and trauma. Bad data leads to bad research, which informs bad clinical practice, which generates more bad data. It's a vicious cycle.
And cultural norms.
Cultural norms reinforce it. If society broadly accepts quiet equals introvert, it shapes how teachers, managers, doctors, and even individuals interpret behavior. The label becomes self-fulfilling. People start identifying with it, maybe even resisting looking deeper because the label feels comfortable or known. It becomes entrenched.
So the misdiagnosis feeds itself at multiple levels.
Yeah.
There's a myth tackled here, too. Personality is fixed, so labeling someone introvert is harmless.
Well, that deterministic view. But it misses the point entirely. Firstly, while core traits have stability, how they manifest can change, and distress isn't a fixed trait. Secondly, and more importantly, if the introversion is actually a trauma response, it's not fixed personality. It's a state of dysregulation and suffering that can potentially heal and change with the right support. Calling it fixed personality prevents that possibility.
So keeping this confusion going, it basically creates systems, healthcare, education work that rely on being wrong to function smoothly.
That's a stark way to put it, but yes. They function by overlooking, by mislabeling, and in doing so, they multiply the harm, locking individuals and the system itself into damaging patterns.
Okay, that's a sobering look at the future trajectory. Let's shift perspective now to layer 4, embodied insight. What's my body telling me?
Yes, this layer brings it right back to felt experience because ultimately the body doesn't really lie in the same way language can. The core question here is, what does your nervous system believe is safe? Not what you logically think, but what your body feels.
And this connects to polyvagal theory, right? The different states of the nervous system.
Exactly. Stephen Porges's work gives us a great map. We have the ventral vagal state. That's where we feel safe, connected, socially engaged, calm, but alert. That's the home base of regulation.
Okay.
Then the sympathetic state, the fight or flight response, mobilized energy to deal with a perceived threat. Heart races, muscles tense. And the dorsal vagal state, the oldest branch, the freeze or shutdown response. Immobilization, collapse, numbness, disconnection when fight or flight isn't possible or doesn't work.
So how does introversion fit into this, and how does trauma shutdown fit?
Generally speaking, true introversion, choosing solitude for restoration, happens within the ventral vagal state. You're calm, grounded, choosing quiet from a place of safety.
Okay.
Trauma-related shutdown, that feeling of collapse or numbness, is primarily a dorsal vagal response. It's the body's emergency brake when overwhelmed by threat. Very different physiological states.
So we can contrast trait versus state using this model, like leaving a party.
Let's try.
Yeah.
An introvert, ventral, might leave feeling pleasantly tired, ready for quiet restoration. Someone in a trauma response, moving towards dorsal, maybe via sympathetic, might leave feeling overwhelmed, agitated, or suddenly numb and desperate to escape the perceived danger of social connection.
What about just being quiet in a group?
Introvert, ventral, listening contentedly, processing internally, choosing not to speak unless they have something specific to add, feels relatively calm.
Trauma response. Dorsal sympathetic freeze. Feeling frozen, unable to speak, terrified of saying the wrong thing, maybe feeling invisible or numb, heart potentially pounding even while silent. Time alone.
Introvert, ventral, feels restorative, calming, enjoyable. Energy replenishes.
Trauma response. Dorsal sympathetic. Might still feel unsafe, even alone, hypervigilant, anxious, or deeply numb and disconnected. Solitude doesn't bring true peace. Social engagement when it happens.
Introvert, ventral, can enjoy connection, especially deeper conversations, but manages energy. Feels safe, present.
Trauma response, sympathetic dorsal. Might feel highly anxious, scanning for rejection or danger, might dissociate during conversation, or feel completely shut down and unable to connect authentically. And the internal state generally.
Interventral, generally calm, grounded, self-aware, comfortable in their own skin.
Trauma response, sympathetic dorsal cycles. Often feels unsafe, anxious, restless, or numb, disconnected, sense of dread, shame.
That comparison really highlights the different internal landscapes. And this ties into Porges's concept of neuroception.
Neuroception, what's that?
It's our nervous system's subconscious process of scanning for cues of safety and danger in our environment, other people, even our internal state. It happens automatically, beneath conscious awareness.
So someone with a trauma history, Their neuroception might be biased towards detecting threat.
Exactly. Their system is constantly unconsciously asking, is it safe? And often landing on no, even when logically the situation is fine. This keeps them out of that calm ventral vagal state.
And this affects things like heart rate variability or HRV.
Yes. HRV reflects the flexibility of our nervous system, our ability to shift between states. Healthy, regulated folks, including typical introverts, tend to have higher, more flexible HRV. Chronic trauma often leads to reduced HRV, indicating a less flexible, more rigidly stuck nervous system, often in states of hyper or hypoarousal. Lower vagal tone is common.
We touched on brain differences earlier. Can we recap those key distinctions in this embodied context?
Sure. Introverts. Maybe higher baseline arousal, dopamine sensitivity leading to preference for calm, default mode network activity suggesting internal focus, generally a brain operating from a place of relative safety.
Okay.
Trauma survivors, often that hyperactive amygdala threat detector, underactive prefrontal cortex regulation, altered hippocampus memory context, maybe a highly active insula involved in interoception, sensing internal body states, often heightened and distressing in trauma. A brain wired for survival, anticipating danger.
So the actual felt sense in the body must be incredibly different. It's not just thoughts, it's physical sensation.
Absolutely. Pat Ogden's work in somatic psychology emphasizes this. What does quiet feel like in your body? Is it restful ease? Or is it tense silence, a held breath, a knot in your stomach, a feeling of bracing?
The sensations tell the story.
They really do. It comes back to Van der Kolk, the body keeps the score. Trauma isn't just a memory. It lives in our tissues, our posture, our breathing patterns, our gut feelings.
Lisa Feldman Barrett's work on emotions fits here too, doesn't it? Emotions as predictions based on our body's state.
Yes, her theory of constructed emotions suggests our brain predicts what sensations mean based on past experience and our current body budget, our internal resources.
So if past experiences involve threat during social interaction, or if our body budget is depleted due to chronic stress,
our brain might predict future social interactions as costly or dangerous, generating feelings of anxiety or a drive to withdraw, interpreting internal sensations through that lens of threat.
which debunks another myth. I just prefer being alone.
It challenges us to ask why. Is it a preference born from safety and choice, ventral vagal? Or is it a preference born from fear, overwhelm, and a nervous system screaming danger, sympathetic dorsal? The body often knows the answer even when the mind tells a simpler story.
So the core message of embodied insight: listen to your body. What feels like genuine restoration versus what feels like bracing or shutting down. That difference is key. What we call introversion might actually be an embodied, unresolved trauma response playing out in our nervous system.
Exactly. The felt sense is the compass.
Okay, let's move to layer 5, human-centered design. How do real people actually behave, and how do our systems account for this complexity?
This layer critiques how we build our environments. Schools, offices, even therapy rooms, often based on simplistic assumptions, like the introvert label, without considering the reality of trauma.
So designing for the label, not the human.
Pretty much. Think about open-plan offices designed for collaboration. Might be okay for some extroverts, maybe draining for introverts, but potentially triggering and overwhelming for someone with trauma, whose nervous system needs predictability and safety cues.
Or classrooms rewarding quiet compliance.
Right. Is the child quiet because they're thoughtfully introverted, or because they're frozen in fear or dissociated due to home stress? The design often doesn't differentiate. Therapy waiting rooms, too, sometimes stark, overly bright, not feeling contained or safe for someone already hypervigilant.
A key point here is motivation versus behavior. The same action can stem from totally different internal drivers.
Absolutely crucial. Let's take some examples. Behavior. Avoiding parties.
Introvert motivation. Conserving energy prefers deeper connection. Trauma motivation. Fear of overwhelm, triggers, social anxiety, feeling unsafe.
Behavior. Being quiet and eating.
Introvert motivation. Processing internally, waiting to contribute thoughtfully. Trauma motivation.
Yeah.
Fear of judgment, feeling frozen, dissociation, belief they have nothing valuable to say.
Behavior. Working alone.
Introvert motivation. Focuses better, finds collaboration draining. Trauma motivation. Mistrust of others, need for control, avoids potential conflict or vulnerability.
Behavior. Having few close friends.
Introvert motivation. Prefers depth over breadth, invests energy selectively. Trauma motivation. Difficulty with trust and intimacy due to attachment wounds, fear of abandonment or betrayal.
Behavior. Needing time alone after socializing.
Introvert motivation.
Yeah.
Recharge depleted social battery. feels restored afterwards. Trauma motivation, recover from hyperarousal or shutdown triggered by social interaction, may still feel unsafe or numb afterwards.
See, same behavior, vastly different why. Design needs to account for the why, not just the what.
And masking complicates this further.
Right.
People hiding their true state.
Hugely. Someone with social anxiety due to trauma might force themselves to be outgoing, to appear normal. They look extroverted, but inside they're falling apart. Systems designed assuming behavior equals internal state will completely miss these people.
Which brings us back to why things like the MBTI are such poor design tools.
Exactly. They categorize based on self-reported preferences, which might themselves be shaped by trauma or masking. They don't capture the underlying nervous system state or motivation. Designing based on MBTI is like designing a building based on favorite colors instead of structural engineering.
There's also a cultural dimension to interpreting behavior, isn't there?
Yes, definitely. Quietness is interpreted differently across cultures. In some East Asian cultures, for example, being quiet might be valued as showing respect or thoughtfulness.
Whereas in many Western cultures, there's that extrovert ideal. So quietness might be seen as shy, aloof, or even suspicious.
Right. So a system designed with only one cultural lens will misinterpret behavior from people from other backgrounds, potentially layering cultural misunderstanding on top of the introversion trauma confusion.
And the user experience of therapy itself needs consideration for the trauma shy.
Absolutely. If therapy feels too clinical, too demanding of immediate disclosure, or the therapist isn't attuned to nonverbal cues of distress or shutdown.
The person might mask even in therapy, pretend they're okay.
Yes, or just feel unsafe and unable to engage authentically. The very design of the interaction needs to be trauma-informed, creating safety before demanding vulnerability.
It's interesting, the sources frame both introversion and trauma responses as evolutionary adaptations in a way.
Yeah, introversion as perhaps a strategy for careful observation and energy conservation, and trauma responses fight, flight, freeze as survival mechanisms that helped our ancestors deal with acute threats. The problem is when those survival responses get stuck on long after the threat is gone.
Which debunks another myth. She's just quiet.
It's just too simplistic. Quiet can mean contented introversion, thoughtful processing, cultural difference, shyness, fear, dissociation, overwhelm, depression. Assuming it's just one thing is poor design.
So human-centered design means designing systems, schools, workplaces, healthcare, therapy that acknowledge the messy reality of human beings, including the prevalence of trauma, and don't rely on simplistic labels.
Exactly. Designed for the range of human experience, not for a neat category.
Okay, layer 6. Risk and resilience. What breaks when we get this wrong, and how can systems become stronger?
This layer looks at the fragility of systems built on that flawed assumption. Quiet equals introvert. When a system relies on that simplification, it's inherently brittle.
What are the specific risks? Let's start with over-pathologizing actual introversion, mistaking it for something wrong.
Right. If someone who is genuinely introverted is constantly told they should be more outgoing or that their need for quiet is a problem, like social anxiety or depression when it isn't.
They might feel shame, like something's wrong with them.
Exactly. Unnecessary shame, maybe inappropriate medication if misdiagnosed, the wrong kind of therapy pushing them to be someone they're not, leading to burnout trying to perform extroversion.
Okay, so that's one risk. What about the flip side? The risks of underpathologizing trauma by calling it introversion.
This is arguably where the greater, more widespread harm occurs. Untreated CPTSD, obviously, with all the consequences we discussed, mental health struggles, physical health decline.
Right.
Dissociation gets ignored or normalized as just being spacey. Deep attachment wounds are misunderstood as just preferring distance. The underlying drivers of suffering aren't addressed.
The severe risks.
Increased suicide risk remains a stark reality. Re-traumatization can happen if someone is pushed into situations their nervous system can't handle because everyone thinks they're just introverted.
We mentioned therapy dropout earlier due to misattunement.
Yes, a huge risk. The therapeutic relationship breaks down because the therapist isn't seeing the real issue. The client leaves, often feeling more hopeless, thinking even therapy can't help me.
And educational systems. How can they break things further?
By rewarding the quiet, compliant child who might actually be dissociating or suffering silently, the system inadvertently reinforces the trauma response, teaching the child that invisibility is rewarded. This is a form of institutional neglect, even violence in a way.
Wow. And workplaces engaging in performative inclusion.
Ah, yes. Celebrating introverts with quiet zones or articles, but still fundamentally misunderstanding or penalizing trauma-driven behaviors like needing clear boundaries, struggling with sudden change, or appearing less enthusiastic in brainstorming sessions. It's cosmetic tokenism.
And that feedback loop failure, again, bad diagnosis leading to bad research.
It's a major systemic risk. If our research and diagnostic criteria are built on flawed foundations, the whole system becomes less effective, less able to accurately identify or help those in need.
So these systems are fragile. What's the alternative? The concept of anti-fragility comes up.
Right. Nassim Taleb's idea. Anti-fragile systems don't just resist shocks, they actually get stronger from stressors and disruption. They learn and adapt.
How would that apply here? What makes an institution anti-fragile in dealing with introversion and trauma?
Anti-fragile systems would assume complexity. They wouldn't rely on simple labels. They'd have mechanisms for deeper assessment, prioritize psychological safety, encourage open communication about needs without penalty, train staff in trauma-informed practices, and have feedback loops that actually listen and adapt based on individual experiences.
Can you give examples? Fragile versus anti-fragile.
Okay. Fragile school rewards quiet compliance, ignores underlying reasons. Anti-fragile school trains teachers in trauma awareness, checks in with quiet students, offers varied support options.
Fragile workplace. Open plan office rewards performative extroversion, annual reviews based on potentially biased observations.
Anti-fragile workplace offers flexible work options, trains managers to understand different communication styles and signs of distress, focuses on outcomes, not just visible effort, anonymous feedback channels.
Fragile therapy assumes client report at face value, standard protocols only. Anti-fragile therapy assesses nervous system state, attunes to nonverbal cues, adapts approach based on client's window of tolerance, explicitly discusses safety.
This tackles the myth. Being trauma-informed means diagnosing everyone with trauma.
Right, it's not about slapping another label on everyone.
Not at all. It's about holding the possibility that quietness or withdrawal might stem from trauma and creating systems that are sensitive and responsive enough to differentiate and support accordingly without making harmful assumptions either way. It's about humility and curiosity.
So the conclusion for risk and resilience. Mislabeling is like a canary in the coal mine, signaling a fragile system. We need systems designed with the assumption that quiet individuals might be struggling, and build in the capacity to respond wisely and flexibly.
Precisely. Build systems that expect and can handle the complex truth.
Which brings us to the final layer, the execution engine. What do we actually do now? How do we put all this insight into practice?
This is about moving from understanding to action. We need to build systems and even personal awareness that can differentiate between these states more effectively.
What tools or approaches can help?
The sources suggest things like a trait versus state question set, guiding questions to help individuals, clinicians, or even managers discern the why behind the behavior.
What kind of questions?
Questions exploring what's the motivation for seeking solitude? How do you feel after time alone, restored, or still uneasy? Where does your energy come from in social settings? What's your relational history, like patterns of trust or mistrust? What signals does your body send in social or quiet situations? What's your typical somatic state? Calm, anxious, numb.
Getting beyond the surface behavior to the internal experience.
Exactly. And maybe even a kind of diagnostic triage map linking common signals like persistent avoidance plus negative self-talk plus physical tension to likely states, possibly trauma-related, and suggesting appropriate next steps like seeking trauma-informed assessment.
Practical tools. What about broader principles for systems?
Trauma-informed design principles are key. For education, prioritize safety and connection, train staff, offer flexible learning environments. For therapy, emphasize attunement, psychoeducation about the nervous system, somatic approaches, focus on building safety. For workplaces, promote psychological safety, offer flexibility, train managers, destigmatize needing support, focus on clear communication and boundaries.
And for listeners questioning themselves, is there a self-check?
Yes, a kind of 5-part self-check could be useful. 1, motivation check. Why do I seek solitude? Fear or restoration. 2, feeling check. How do I feel after solitude? Restored or still anxious, numb? 3, social energy check. Is it just draining or actively threatening, overwhelming? 4, history check. Are there past experiences influencing my present patterns? 5, body check. What are the physical sensations underlying my quietness, tension, ease, numbness?
A personal inquiry framework.
And the overall approach, the ITS prototyping group. Observe the reality, including your own, orient with better frameworks like polyvagal theory, decide on a small change or inquiry, act, and then learn from the result. Iterate.
This counters the final myth. Knowing you're an introvert is empowering.
It can be if it's accurate, but if that label is masking untreated trauma, it's disempowering. It prevents access to true understanding and healing. Real empowerment comes from understanding the actual roots of your experience, whatever they may be.
So the call to action isn't just more labels. It's better protocols, better design, clinical humility, systemic courage.
Yes, it's about daring to look underneath the convenient introvert label, asking the harder questions, prioritizing moral clarity over simplistic answers, and building systems that reflect the complex, embodied truth of human experience.
A powerful tool to shift our perspective. So to wrap up this deep dive, we started with that question. Are you introverted, or are you actually dealing with the echoes of trauma?
And we've seen the difference often isn't in the quietness, the need for space, but in the why. Is it choice and energy management from a place of safety?
Or is it protection, shutdown, and dysregulation born from past wounds?
The cost of choosing the simpler answer, just introverted, can be immense. We risk losing people in plain sight, validating masks instead of seeing the person underneath.
But the potential for understanding and healing is also immense if we dare to look deeper.
Absolutely. And as we explored in embodied insight, your body often holds the most honest answers. Learning to listen to its signals, the tension, the ease, the numbness, the activation is key.
That really connects back to the core purpose of the thinking stack, doesn't it? Unstacking these layers of assumption and illusion to get closer to what's real.
Exactly. It requires curiosity, honesty, and a willingness to sit with complexity rather than reaching for easy answers.
Thank you. That was a really illuminating journey through a complex topic. Lots to think about.
Indeed. The work continues.